angel, will you be mine? My darling dear, love you all the time. I'm just a fool in love with you. Earth angel, the one I adore, love you forever and evermore. I'm just a fool in love with you. I fell for you, and I knew the vision of your loveliness. I hoped and I prayed that someday I'll be the vision of your happiness. Oh, earth angel, please be mine. My darling dear, love you all the time. I'm just a fool in love with you. I fell for you, and I knew the vision of your loveliness. I hope and pray that someday that I'll be the vision of your happiness. Oh, earth angel, earth angel.
Hello everyone, thank you for listening. It is your host, Emmanuel I. Smith, and today's date is June 9th, Tuesday, 2026. The time is 4:56 p.m. and I'm in Miami-Dade County, Florida. The topic of today's lecture is Cuba, Terrorism, and the Gangstalking Connection, Part 18, Fidel Castro's Narcotics Prism. And ladies and gentlemen, I do these lectures outdoors, so I may have to raise or project my voice in order to keep down the background noise. Please adjust your volume accordingly, and thank you for listening. So, ladies and gentlemen, I've decided to do a Part 18 of Cuba, Terrorism, and the Gangstalking Connection. And the reason I've decided to do a Part 18 is because this topic is one of particular importance to me as a Floridian, particularly somebody that lives in South Florida. Ultimately, ladies and gentlemen, this is a defining topic for any South Floridian. I don't believe that most Cuban American people are advocates of everything that happens in Cuba or everything that has happened in Cuba. However, I feel a obligation and a commitment to talking about this problem as I would any problem that I think is of importance. And this problem that I'm talking about, the problem that I'm speaking about, is the problem of narco-terrorism, particularly that brand of narco-terrorism that has kept Cuba from becoming the country that it could be, and has kept Miami-Dade County from becoming the county that it could be. All of these things need to be put into their proper perspective, and I tend to draw from the past because it gives us insight into the present and the future. And I think by understanding the history of Cuba and the various socio-political challenges that it's faced particularly over the past 60 years, I think it's going to give us valuable insights into the present and what is possible in the future. Now, ultimately, ladies and gentlemen, as a person who has encountered persons here in South Florida that I believe to be narco-terrorists, it serves as an enlightening experience to come across such persons, and it strikes me as a bit odd that in the United States, which is a country that takes national security seriously, particularly to the tune of about $2 trillion a year for national security equipment and apparatus that helps the United States find and neutralize any threat that it deems as detrimental to national security. The United States spends more on national security apparatus than any other country in the world. And it spends more on national security apparatus than many countries in the world combined. So that's an indicator to me that national security is a priority for the United States, seeing as how it spends so much of its taxpayer revenues on national security interests. There's nothing wrong with valuing national security. Every country in the world has a budget for national security, and every country in the world wants its homeland to be secure. Now, the question that has perplexed me for probably 8 years now, which is the sum of my time here in Miami-Dade County, is how does the United States qualify allowing the kinds of organized crime elements here in Miami-Dade County to thrive, given the United States' general interest in national security? How is it that Miami or South Florida is treated differently? I mean, the organized crime that takes place here in South Florida is not only prevalent, but it's obvious. And I know I'm not the only one that sees it. I mean, you got a little bit of everything down here. You got narcotics trafficking. You got a hidden camera network that films people in the bathrooms of various public and private institutions and sells the videos on the black market. You have human trafficking galore here. You got immigration scams. You got pawn shop scams. You got bribery and kickbacks as far as the eye can see for government contracts, particularly at the federal and state levels. You got insurance fraud as far as the eye can see. You got welfare fraud as far as the eye can see here. You got carjacking rings. No doubt there are child pornography rings here. You have illegal arms dealing that goes on here. You got computer hacking rings that occur here. You have all kinds of corrupt activities that go on right here in South Florida unchecked. And it just strikes me as a bit odd, ladies and gentlemen, because we have the manpower, we have the technology, we have the operational know-how to eliminate this activity wherever it happens in South Florida. And furthermore, you have all kinds of other criminal activity that occur here. For example, you have a hitman industry here in South Florida. I mean, you got cheap hitmen that walk around pestering people, and at some point somebody may offer them a small sum of money to take someone's life. And then you have your more industrial grade assassination rings right here in South Florida, where you can pay a highly trained, experienced hitman to go somewhere and take somebody's life for a nominal fee. Furthermore, you have other kinds of deleterious activity, like you have, for example, robbers for hire. You have assault men for hire. You have pesterers for hire. You have car thieves for hire. You have home invaders for hire. I mean, there's really nothing you can't pay somebody in South Florida to do. I mean, if any crime you need done here in South Florida, there's somebody you could just walk up to and pay them to do it. I mean, what the question that begs to be asked, ladies and gentlemen, is South Florida a part of the United States or not? Just give me the rundown. I mean, answer my question candidly. Is South Florida being treated as a member of the international community? Does South Florida operate under international laws? Or does South Florida operate under the laws that are set forth by federal, state, and local legislatures of this country? Quite frankly. And before I continue, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to invoke my First Amendment right under the U.S. Constitution to say what I'm saying and to continue saying what I'm saying, regardless of its positive or negative connotation. Now, ladies and gentlemen, it takes me back to a central narrative, okay? Depending on who you talk to, yeah, okay, the United States is it's a part of the U.S. and South Florida is a part of the U.S. and it operates the same way any geographic area in the country operates. Okay, you can say that if you want to. I beg to differ. All right, I think that South Florida is essentially, I mean, it's, now, mind you, without being critical of the elected officials here, because not every elected official has up-to-date or up-to-the-minute information as to how black market activity or organized crime works in their jurisdictions. That stuff is typically handled by the Department of Homeland Security, the FBI, the U.S. Marshals, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, and to a degree, the Department of the U.S. Armed Services. They look into organized crime and sophisticated crimes also. They help they aid law enforcement in that capacity. So you have more than enough resources. And what I'm trying to figure out is what's different about South Florida. Why is organized crime, including all the ugly crimes that I've just named, tolerated here? What could it possibly be? Well, it's hard to say. I mean, everybody in South Florida has their hand dipped in something. I mean, of course you have your regular 9 to 5 people, but everyone's got their hand dipped into something, and everybody wants something a little extra here. Why? Because South Florida is made out of money. It has a history of being an organized crime den. And there's a lot of wealth and increase here. And people see it. And sometimes people go out of their way and go and try and grab a piece of that wealth and increase. Legally or illegally. So it's hard to qualify why so much organized crime is allowed to thrive here. I mean, if you go to a city like Kendall, Florida, you got guys making chemical weapons in their apartments. You got guys making homemade explosives in their apartments. You got guys making 3D printed weapons in their apartments. You got narco terrorists that just deal dope openly in public parks in front of men, women, and children, and no one seems to care. You got people using directed energy weapons in Kendall. You got people robbing and assaulting people in Kendall. Not just because they're desperate, but because someone told them to go do it. It's robbery rings. It's mugging rings. It's theft rings. It's part of organized crime. And it's just strange. I mean, first you have a program like Gangstalking that's allowed to manifest, not only here in South Florida, but across the country. Then, to make matters even worse, now you have basically organized crime manifesting on top of the gangstalking. And it's looks like it's unchecked, ladies and gentlemen. And you know, some people believe that it's just the natural order of things. South Florida is in a tropical location. It's got a history from receiving dope shipments from South American and Caribbean countries. And some people go even further than that and say, you know what, South Florida is the house that Fidel Castro built. You know, ladies and gentlemen, Fidel Castro was a peculiar man. All right, in the 1960s, he worked with other revolutionaries like Che Guevara to remove the Batista regime from power in Cuba. Why? Because they saw the Batista regime as a symbol of imperialism, particularly because the Batista regime in Cuba was caused and sustained by the American CIA. And Che Guevara and Fidel Castro looked at that and said, you know what? We don't want the CIA operating in Cuba. We don't like the CIA setting up puppet regimes in Cuba. We don't like the CIA manipulating the destiny of Cuban people. So Che Guevara and Fidel Castro worked to get the CIA out of there. And they succeeded eventually. In theory. I mean, Guevara was captured and executed, but Fidel Castro lived on with an anti-American mindset and a desire to raise as much cash overseas as possible to make Cuba better. Fidel Castro wanted revenue. He wanted increase. He wanted to bring in the kind of money that it takes to stabilize a people. But there was a problem. Exports from Cuba to the Western world and to the greater world generally were scarce. Cuba did not bring in enough from the export of sugar, bananas, and tobacco to the rest of the world to sustain the Cuban government. The Cuban government needed more than that. Okay, Fidel Castro didn't want to see Cuba poor. Fidel Castro didn't want to see Cuba as a third world country. Fidel Castro didn't want Cuba to be seen as a weak nation that relied on others. Fidel Castro had a dream. He had a cocaine dream. Okay, and some might call this cocaine dream Fidel Castro's cocaine ambition. All right, Fidel Castro didn't want to just be a cocaine kingpin. Fidel Castro wanted to be a cocaine hero. All right, a cocaine hero unto the Cuban people. He wanted to find a way to exploit the sale of some of the purest, most potent white cocaine you've ever seen to Western buyers in exchange for cold hard cash, which he could then reinvest in Cuban infrastructure and the Cuban way of life. Ladies and gentlemen, I think it's safe to say that Fidel Castro had a cocaine passion. And he needed to exploit that passion to the full in order to bring stability and economic progress to Cuba. And it wasn't just the United States that Fidel wanted to export cocaine and heroin to. He wanted to export it to every country in the greater world. And then use that money that came back to invest in the DNI, the Directorate of National Intelligence in Cuba, so Cuba could have some surveillance capacities. Cuba didn't want to be the Cuban government didn't want to be the only government in the world that didn't have power of surveillance. They wanted satellites too. They wanted hidden equipment too. They wanted spies and espionage as well. They wanted satellites and all that. The only way that was going to be possible, ladies and gentlemen, is if the Cuban government got involved with the sale and export of cocaine, heroin, and quaaludes. But ladies and gentlemen, this had to be a cooperative mission. Fidel Castro was not going to attain his cocaine ambition alone. Such an ambition needed the assistance of other like-minded governments, particularly those in Central America, South America, and the Caribbean islands, so as to ensure that Fidel Castro's cocaine ambition would at some point in the trajectory of his premiership become a cocaine achievement. Ladies and gentlemen. And it was Fidel Castro's Cuba that shipped the 27 billion in cocaine to the United States in the early 80s. You know, some people think of what you might refer to as the cocaine 80s as an interesting anthropological season in the history of Miami-Dade County, Florida. Ladies and gentlemen, when you think of the cocaine 80s here in South Florida, some images come to mind. All right, you think of guys walking around in $3,000 Versace shirts. They got $6,000 worth of jewelry on. They got a $2,500 pair of Versace pants on. They have on a $3,500 pair of alligator shoes. They got on an $1,800 pair of Louis Vuitton glasses. They got a $600 haircut. And they drive a $40,000 BMW car. They got a cellular device, $500 a month. They got a pager, $200 a month. They live in a high-rise luxury apartment, $1,800 a month. And then they have a high-dollar girlfriend that costs $1,800 a month to maintain. They go to the hottest nightclubs on the weekends. They have high-profile meetings with other dope dealers across the city. And from Monday through Friday, they are organizing cocaine deals that bring them in tens of thousands of dollars a day in revenues. And even above these guys who are underbosses, you have kingpins. People who deal directly with government agents and affiliates of the Cuban, Nicaraguan, Bolivian, Colombian, Mexican, Panamanian, and Peruvian governments. Fidel Castro looked over at the United States and said, "My name is Fidel Castro, and I'd like to sell you some cocaine." And what did the United States federal government say to that? They said, "Come right on in, Fidel. We've been waiting on you." Fidel Castro said, "Gracias, we're gonna send a shipment. We got 18 tons of heroin, we got 18 tons of cocaine, and we got 600,000 Quaalude tablets coming in on a ship. We're gonna dock it in the Florida Keys, and I got some narco terrorists there waiting on the shipment. What we're going to do is we're going to unload the shipments off of the naval vessels. We're going to put it in the hands of affiliates that we trust. We're going to pay the Coast Guard to turn the other cheek and to turn their heads the other way. And we're going to unload these drugs, which have our street retail value of $31 billion. And we're going to put it in the hands of about 2,500 dealers, and we're going to move it through the city like a hurricane. Okay, the Fidel Castro regime, ladies and gentlemen, gave a new definition to the term Miami hurricane. Some people, when you hear the term Miami hurricane, you think of an actual natural event. Other people, when they hear Miami hurricane, they think of the University of Miami sports teams. But Fidel Castro looked over into Miami and said, I'm going to give the term Miami hurricane a new definition. Because with the assistance of my friends in the East and my friends in the South, we are going to initiate a cocaine revolution in the United States that is going to sweep through Miami quicker and more powerfully than any hurricane that has ever swept through. We are going to bring a Miami cocaine hurricane into Miami. And this cocaine hurricane is going to sweep through the city like nothing you've ever seen. Some people looked at that cocaine hurricane and said, wow, Fidel Castro is not playing around, is he? There were some Americans that looked over at him like, we're going to start calling him Uncle Fidel, because he takes care of us. He takes care of us like an uncle. He gives us all the cocaine we can handle. You know, back in the 80s, they called it nose candy. And that was Fidel Castro's motto: candy makes you dandy. So Fidel Castro sent all the cocaine that he could into the United States, and he told the people of this country, he said, dig right in. We can get it to you at anywhere from $2,000 to $2,500 an ounce. Dig right in. All right, Fidel Castro's mentality towards the cocaine business was, with the help of our friends in the East and then with the help of our friends in the South, we're going to take these cocaine shipments and we're going to dock them in the south of Florida. And when we move it, we're going to move it quick and we're going to move it efficiently. Okay? Fidel Castro was of the mindset, I don't care what your occupation is. This cocaine that I'm selling, this will raise the standard of living for you and your family. All right, and that was exactly what Fidel Castro did. He realized his cocaine ambition. And he did it in such a way so as to leave Americans scratching their heads as to the implications. There were Americans that were perplexed and awestruck at what was happening. They scratched their head and said, well, what of Fidel Castro's cocaine business? And here we're talking about it openly, too. You got Dan Rather, the noted news journalist. Apparently, he did an interview with Fidel Castro, which we're going to read here in a little bit. And he was awestruck. He was starstruck. As soon as Fidel Castro walked in the studio, Dan Rather looked at him and said, wow, Fidel. Thank you for being here today. And then he looked at his news crew and said, hey, look, everybody, it's Fidel Castro himself. The first man in history to assume presidential power and become a dope kingpin, all within just a few years. And Fidel Castro thanked Mr. Rather for having him on the set, and Fidel Castro assured Mr. Dan Rather, he said, it's not just my goal to bring in billions in revenues. He said, I want to be a hero to the Cuban people. And that's what we're going to talk about, ladies and gentlemen. We're talking about Cuba, terrorism, and the Gangstalking connection. We're going to read a number of documents here. And we're going to do an analysis of these documents because these documents give us historical insight into just how important narcotics was to the Castro regime. It was everything. Okay, narcotics was to Fidel Castro what coal is, what coal and natural gas is to the United States. Narcotics was to the Castro regime what oil was to Venezuela. Equally, cocaine and narcotics were to the Castro regime what oil was to Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Iran, Nigeria, so many countries around the world. Okay, I mean, imagine any country in the world's major export and how that country relies on those exports for their sustenance. Fidel Castro, his major export was narcotics. And he brought in tens of billions of dollars in revenues per year and shared them with his friends in the East and in the South. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a lot to cover, so let's start. The first article is a Washington Times article that is dated March 21, 1985. The section of this article is called Lofton on the Loose, and it is written by a writer named John Lofton. And the title of this news article is Rather Lets Castro Off Hook in Drug Interview. So I'll take a couple of more puffs of this tobacco here and we'll get started. And while I'm thinking of it, ladies and gentlemen, I want to educate the whole world on this. I want the American people to be educated. I want the people of Cuba to be educated. I want the people of Latin America to be educated. I want the people of Central America to be educated. I want the people of Mexico to be educated. I want the people of the Caribbean to be educated. I want the people of Asia and Eastern Europe and Western Europe and the Nordic people and the Mediterranean people, the African people, the Austronesian people. Okay, I want people all over the world to be educated by this work. And we are going to begin, ladies and gentlemen, and we're going to start with the first paragraph, which reads, "The opportunity was golden. In one quarter was Dan Rather, the man CBS has hailed in a full-page newspaper ad as America's #1 newsman. In the other corner was this hemisphere's #1 communist thug, Fidel Castro. But it was no contest. Mr. Rather was embarrassingly unprepared. Leading into this interview, Mr. Rather says Mr. Castro was willing, even eager, to cooperate with the United States and other countries in stopping international drug trafficking. But he says Mr. Castro vehemently denied his government or anyone in it has anything to do with narcotics profiteering. Now, I'll stop at the first paragraph and give you a rundown as to the significance. So this author here, Mr. John Lofton, considers Dan Rather to be a top-notch guy. Okay, the number one newsman in America, the most watched news anchor in the country. And he referred to Fidel Castro as a thug. But what he's saying is that despite the discrepancy in personal character, Dan Rather was astonishingly unprepared for this interview. And he didn't think that Mr. Rather threw the curveballs that he needed to throw to Fidel Castro with respect to this narcotics thing. And it says here, following this, Mr. Rather is shown in Havana asking Mr. Castro about charges that Cuba is involved in the worldwide drug trade. A wildly gesticulating Mr. Castro said there are no drugs in Cuba. Charges that drugs come through Cuba from Latin America are a lie and absolutely false, he says. Mr. Castro says Cuba has the cleanest history in the field of drugs. Cubans have been practically the guardians of the Caribbean, he says. Mr. Castro says he does not know of a single case where a Cuban official was involved in the drug business, never in 26 years. Later, Mr. Rather notes in hours of off-camera conversation, Mr. Castro said 3 times he wanted to help stop international narcotics traffic. In fact, says Mr. Rather, he was willing to shoot down some drug-running airplanes over Cuba if he got help in identifying such an aircraft. Now, okay, so Fidel Castro is basically saying that not only is Cuba not a narcotics hub, but he's saying that Cuban officials aren't involved either, and that they're the guardians of Cuba. Well, that is an absolute lie, ladies and gentlemen. We have read together in previous lectures on this very topic testimony from Cuban officials to the United States Congress that not only was Cuba a hub for narcotics that was eventually shipped to the United States and points west, but that Mr. Castro himself and Cuban officials were involved in it. Furthermore, there were actually Cuban officials that testified themselves that they were involved in it, and that it was a thriving business. So Fidel Castro got on, Dan Rather was on CBS. Fidel Castro went on CBS and just plain lied, which I'm not sure that was the smartest thing for him to do, because the CIA already knew the truth, that Cuba was a narco-terrorist entity. And there were off-camera conversations that Dan Rather had with Fidel, where Fidel Castro said, not only do we want to stop anything that resembles narcotics trafficking coming from Cuba to the U.S., but if we found that there was an airplane anywhere around Cuba that had the intention of transporting dope over the ocean to Cuba, we'd shoot it down. And that was probably their rationale when they shot down the Brothers to the Rescue planes, which were humanitarian aid planes, they probably said, you know what, those planes look peculiar. They're probably dope planes and we're going to shoot them down. So the Cuban Air Force shot down some brothers to the rescue planes, claiming that they were narcotics planes, bringing in narcotics from overseas, when in fact they were trying to supply humanitarian aid to Cuban people. All right, and that happened in 1996, and 30 years later, the people who authorized the shoot down of those planes are being charged with capital murder by the United States. So that is sort of the long and short of that particular matter. We have narco-terrorists right here in Cuba that are proud of their narco-terrorism, and they're proud of the work they do in supplying all people with dope from overseas, and it's truly stunning too, because there's no shame in it. There's no shame in it. It's to the point now where Cuba is asking itself, its government is asking itself, why is the United States even curious about what we do? Don't they have the historical record? Why is the United States getting on Raul Castro for his role in shooting down the brothers to the rescue planes now? The United States knows how we are. The United States has always known how we are. Fidel Castro has already dumped all his felons out of prison and sent them to the United States for the sole purpose of handling cocaine. All it took was the Mariel boat lifts, a ton of dope, and a golden smile. And the cocaine 80s here in the United States commenced with no problem at all. As a matter of fact, the American people welcomed it. They said, I don't know where this cocaine is coming from, but I'll pay $2,000 an ounce for it. And that's what the American people did. And Fidel Castro sat back in his chair in the presidential office in Havana, Cuba, and said, well done, everybody. We have managed to turn the United States into a cocaine paradise. And we're going to continue it. And if the U.S. has anything to say about it, we'll just deny it. It's saying here that there's evidence that Cuba is an international drug terrorist organization. And that is, that's true. I mean, there's no denying that. I mean, it's been that way for almost 50 years. Apparently, according to this article, it's saying that the Cuban government and the Nicaraguan government are two of the biggest dope kingpins that there is. At the time of this interview. And I'll continue. This is not all of the compelling evidence concerning the Castro drug connection. Many U.S. officials would have been eager to show Mr. Castro up for the liar that he is, but they were not put on the air by CBS. Vice President Bush's chief of staff, Admiral Dan Murphy, who also runs the National Narcotics Border Interdiction System, says that what Mr. Castro told Dan Rather was overacting. In an interview, he told me, we have direct evidence and have cited it publicly that Cuban officials are involved in drug trafficking. They let planes carrying drugs fly over their country, and they let ships carrying drugs go through their waters. So basically what this is saying is that if you're affiliated with the Cuban government, you can fly a Boeing 747 full of dope right over Cuba and drop it off. You can use nationalized Cuban airports for dope smuggling activity. Just make sure that you're affiliated with the Cuban government. Now, if you're a plane and you're flying, you could be flying grapes, tomatoes, oranges, apples, and peanuts over Cuba, your plane is going to get shot down if you're not affiliated with the government or the Cuban Air Force. But if you're affiliated with the Cuban government and you come from overseas with a gigantic jumbo jet full of dope, they'll let you land it right in the president's front yard. Unload it and ship every bit of it to the U.S. Ladies and gentlemen. And yeah, you could be driving a naval ship, a gigantic multi-billion-dollar naval ship over the water, and as long as you have a permission and proper clearances from the Cuban government, you could take a naval destroyer and load it up with as much dope as it can hold. You could park that ship right on the Cuban coast and unload it. And the Cuban government will accommodate you. They'll send a limousine to pick the crew up. They'll take you to a luxury hotel somewhere in downtown Havana, Cuba. They'll let you stay at a luxury hotel for free. They'll give you all the accommodations and room service you can handle. If you're looking for a little fun, they can supply you with a complimentary cocaine bowl that you could keep in your room to keep you occupied during your stay. They'll supply you with fresh liquor imported from Argentina. And if you get really bored, they'll supply you with cheap prostitutes. That'll help you devour your cocaine bowl and your liquor. And then they'll fly you back to wherever you came from, courtesy of the president. And that'll be a weekend in Cuba that you ain't never gonna forget. You ain't never going to forget your weekend in Cuba, and neither will your cohorts. Ladies and gentlemen. I mean, that'll be an experience that you could carry with you for a lifetime. The time you got $100,000 in cash. From the Cuban government, and they wine and dined you for a weekend and sent you back on a luxury jet. All right, you ain't never going to forget that experience, and neither will anybody with you. All right, so we're going to continue. Admiral Murphy says that if Ron Schlesinger, the CBS reporter who interviewed him, had asked him about what Mr. Castro said to Mr. Rather, he would have said, "This doesn't jibe with our evidence. We have direct evidence that traffickers have used Cuban waters to unload and reload marijuana shipments destined for the U.S. We've tracked aircraft laden with drugs across Cuba, and we know they were laden with drugs of various designations. It wasn't just marijuana. They're talking about marijuana shipments in this particular exchange. But it wasn't just marijuana. It was marijuana. It was cocaine. It was heroin. It was MDMA. It was angel dust. It was methaqualone tablets. It was designer drugs. It was every kind of hard drug you could ever imagine. All right, and the goal was to turn every street corner in the United States into a cocaine convenience store. You walk in, you make your purchase, and you walk out. Um, so we'll go on to the next paragraph. We have watched these planes dump marijuana into the ocean, turn around, fly back over Cuba, and disappear. So in other words, and again, we're just talking about marijuana in this particular sequence. Okay, because marijuana was part of the deal. It wasn't just narcotics and hard drugs coming across the sea to the U.S., courtesy of Cuba. It was also marijuana, which some people don't have a problem with, and some people do. It just depends on what you believe about the drug. Or as some people refer to it, just as a simple herb that's cultivated. But ultimately, ladies and gentlemen, what this guy is describing here is a situation where planes were dropping off shipments over Cuba and then sort of doing a U-turn and flying back into the heartland of Cuba and disappearing. So that means that these dope planes were not only authorized by the Cuban government, but welcomed as a part of government operations. And then those planes would fly into the heartland of Cuba right in front of the investigators' eyes and disappear. That means that they were offered a landing strip and the opportunity to dock and station right there in Cuba until it was time to go back to wherever it is they came from. Admiral Murphy says he would have said this to Mr. Schlesinger, but he was not asked. He says he was asked about the possibility of sharing information about drugs with Mr. Castro, replying, I said that this was not necessary because he knows where the hell it is and all he has to do is stop it. Mr. Schlesinger tells me he thinks that he did ask Admiral Murphy about Mr. Castro's remarks to Mr. Rather, but Admiral Murphy may have had a better memory than I do. In any event, Mr. Rather's report did not include Admiral Murphy saying any of what he told me. Robert Feldkamp, head of public affairs for the Drug Enforcement Administration, tells me that he was called by CBS on this drug story. He says that he told CBS's legal correspondent, Fred Graham, we think Cuba is institutionally involved in drug trafficking. We think Mr. Castro has to be aware that he is sleeping with his head in the sand. Mr. Feldkamp says that Cuba has allowed its waters to be used for safe havens for drug trafficking from Latin America to the U.S. And furthermore, Mr. Feldkamp asked him to describe whether Mr. Castro was cooperating with the United States in trying to restrict the flow of drugs. He told Mr. Graham, no, we have no knowledge of this whatsoever. And he says he told Mr. Graham he knew of no letter of Mr. Castro having been written in offering such cooperation. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop there. I'm going to stop there briefly as I find somewhere else to go. I just had someone walk up and try and disrupt the lecture as usual. But here in the United States, there's no guarantee that any U.S. citizen living in South Florida is going to encounter a narco-terrorist at some point in the trajectory of their stay here in South Florida. I mean, I guess the U.S. is sort of the mindset, well, you're right there in South Florida. You're only 100 miles west of Cuba. Of course, you're going to see some narco-terrorist activity from time to time. What's the big deal, right? That appears to be the United States' attitude towards U.S. citizens that are concerned about narco-terrorism that occurs in South Florida. And it isn't just narco-terrorism, it's also other disruptions, like, for example, organized murders, which are prevalent in Miami-Dade County. These organized, orchestrated murders are obviously a symptom of the narco-terrorism that plagues Miami-Dade County, and ultimately and obviously it's something that's ignored by the national security mechanism here in the United States. Apparently the national security mechanism here in the United States would rather pester people with gang-stalking campaigns then use that same national security know-how to rout out all the narco-terrorism that rears its ugly head right here in South Florida. So I had to move, ladies and gentlemen. I'm in a bit of a noisier spot here. But we are going to continue. So what we have here is a situation where the trajectory of the American experience, okay, and we're not just talking about South Florida, we're talking about the entire American experience, is going to be overshadowed not only by gang stalking, but narco-terrorism here in South Florida. The entire American experience is about to be plagued with this, okay? And quite frankly, ladies and gentlemen, I have nothing to apologize for in bringing this information to the public fold. I mean, I can't remember the last time we've had a congressional hearing on Cuba's role in narco-terrorism and how it affects the American experience. I don't know. Maybe our Congress is just to the point where they're just afraid to offend anybody. I just don't know. But apparently, ladies and gentlemen, narco-terrorism is on the rise. And documents like these help shed some light on exactly what it is that that caused all this. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to continue on with this article. Okay, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to start on the begin or finish on the second upper paragraph here, and I'm going to start just below CBS News report. For example, the Cuban American National Foundation has issued a report, Castro and the Narcotics Connection. It concluded the Cuban government is directly involved in the production and trafficking of narcotics. And what I'm going to do, ladies and gentlemen, I was just disrupted at the spot that I was doing the lecture in. I had two people walk up to the benches that I was seated at, creating a stir, creating noise, pestering, disrupting, typical behavior of gang stalkers. They were obviously signaled over from somewhere, and I don't want to continue the lecture in the midst of all this noise. So I'm going to stop the lecture here, and I'm going to find a quiet spot to sit down, and we're going to continue the lecture. Thank you for listening. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. We are back. And what I'm going to do is, because of the previous interruption, I'm going to do a reread of the top section of Rather Lets Castro Off the Hook in Drug Interview. So we're going to start at the paragraph that says this is a classic example of a major American journalist, and then we're going to read from there. Sorry for the distraction, ladies and gentlemen. Sometimes when I'm reading, if there are stalkers present and they're signaled to me as I'm doing a lecture, oftentimes it can stop my train of thought or distract me. And that's what happened just a second ago, ladies and gentlemen. So I was distracted, actually, and I read the article vertically as opposed to horizontally. So I'm going to reread the top part, and we're going to read it horizontally because that's how this particular style of news article is read. So sorry for the distraction, ladies and gentlemen. I was equally as distracted, and we are going to continue on. This is a classic example of a major American journalist being manipulated by a communist. Evidence that Cuba is in the international drug trade up to its eyeballs and is overwhelming. But Mr. Rather confronted Mr. Castro with none of this evidence, and no one familiar with this evidence was allowed to cite it on the CBS News report. Now, I'm going to stop right there, ladies and gentlemen, because that's significant. That's significant. You have the world's foremost we'll call him a presidential drug kingpin, and you have CBS News cameras pointed right at him. This was a golden opportunity for Dan Rather, okay, to confront Fidel Castro about his narco-terrorist ambitions. And it appears that Dan Rather didn't bring it to Mr. Castro's attention. Hey, we have evidence, documented evidence, not only from the CIA, but from the FBI. We have documented intelligence from our Armed Services Department. Okay, we have documented evidence from a number of government agencies around the world, really, that you, Fidel Castro, participate in narco-terrorist activities and dope smuggling on a grand scale. I'm talking the grandest scale imaginable. We have documented proof of this. Please, how do you respond, Mr. Castro? Okay, that's all Dan Rather had to say. But it appears that Mr. Rather was too starstruck. Because mind you, Fidel Castro was probably internationally known by this point. Everybody knew who Fidel was. Not everyone knew that he was a drug trafficker, but everybody knew Fidel. There wasn't a single head of state anywhere in the world that didn't know who Fidel Castro was. He was a celebrity. Okay, he was one of the few presidents of a country that every other president in the world knew by name. Okay, now keep something in mind, ladies and gentlemen. If you were to hold a round table discussion of educators, politicians, historians, and start running off the names of presidents of countries around the world in 1985, I'm willing to assert that most of those educated people would not know most of the names that you feed them. They wouldn't know the name, and they wouldn't know what country they were the president of. Most people don't know the names of too many presidents of other countries. Most people in the world know the names of the president of their country, but when it comes to other countries, they don't know who's in control, right? Most people don't know the names of so many other presidents of other countries, right? But when you say Fidel Castro, everybody knows him. All right, if you were to ask most Americans, who's the president of Canada? Who's the president of France? Who's the president of England? Who's the president of Germany? Who's the president of Japan? Right? Most Americans wouldn't know how to answer that. Right? In 1985. But if you ask Americans, well, who's the president of Cuba? They all go, oh, that's Fidel Castro. Right? He was sort of a pop culture figure in the United States and around the world. Everybody knew Fidel. There was something about Fidel that grabbed the imagination, right? Ex-revolutionary. He rose from basically a militant insurgent guerrilla organization that took power from the Batista regime. They got the Americans out of there. They got the CIA out of there. They assumed power. He's the underdog that made it to the top. He had the iconic thick beard. He was always wearing his military uniform with the hat, and he had the dog tags on. He was always smoking a fresh Cuban cigar, no matter where he was. I mean, Fidel Castro used to smoke Cuban cigars while he was playing golf. All right, Fidel Castro used to smoke Cuban cigars while he was doing target practice at the shooting range. All right, so Fidel Castro used to smoke Cuban cigars during Catholic Mass. Right? He always had a Cuban cigar in his mouth, always. And it was a form of advertisement because Cuban cigars were a major Cuban export at that time. But ladies and gentlemen, it just goes to show the man's celebrity. I mean, I saw an episode of The Simpsons one time. You know The Simpsons, ladies and gentlemen? with Bart Simpson, Lisa Simpson, Homer Simpson, Marge Simpson, Maggie Simpson. All right, Ned Flanders and Edna and all those guys. Sometimes the Simpsons would have guest appearances. But these appearances were not the real celebrity. It was just a rendering of the celebrity in their show, right? It was a representation of the celebrity. There was an episode of The Simpsons where Fidel Castro was in there. And he met Lisa Simpson. You guys remember that episode? Where Fidel Castro and Lisa Simpson were conversating back and forth. And yeah, Lisa Simpson was only a little girl in that show, but it looked like she was flirting with Fidel in that scene. All right, and the Simpsons creators were comfortable enough with Fidel Castro's celebrity to put him on an episode of The Simpsons. I mean, Fidel Castro was an internationally known guy. And it looks to me, ladies and gentlemen, like when Dan Rather got in a room with him, he just got scared. He got scared. He looked at him and goes, oh my goodness, there's Fidel Castro. You know what? This guy's probably the most well-known politician anywhere in the world. I'm scared to ask him these questions. I think Dan Rather got starstruck, and he didn't want to ask Fidel Castro the necessary questions. All right, so we're going to continue. For example, the Cuban American National Foundation has issued a report titled Castro and the Narcotics Connection. It concluded that the Cuban government is directly involved in the production and trafficking of narcotics with the goal of promoting addiction, violent crime, corruption, and obtaining hard currency. The Cuban government's narcotics profits are used throughout the Americas, and Cuban intelligence agents entered the United States during the Mariel boat lift and have established a narcotics trafficking network. This is the kind of thing that this author, okay, John Lofton, believes that Dan Rather should have confronted Fidel Castro with. You dumped out your prisons, Fidel Castro, of all your felons, and you sent them to the United States on the Mariel boat lifts. And in the mix of all those felons, there were Cuban government agents among them. All of these people were being sent to the United States for one reason and one reason only, and that reason was to facilitate the reception of cocaine shipments from Cuba and sell them to interested buyers across the state of Florida. All right. And then the hard cash, the bulk of it was going to go back to Cuba, and Fidel Castro was going to split it with his friends in Nicaragua, Bolivia, Colombia, Peru, and Chile. Yeah, ladies and gentlemen, there was a golden opportunity for Dan Rather to confront Fidel about this stuff. Hey, man, look, you know, what are you thinking dumping out your prisons of all the felons and putting them on boats and sending them to the United States for the Americans to have to deal with? What are you thinking doing that, Fidel Castro? What are you thinking? What are you thinking, Fidel Castro? What are you thinking? That's all Dan Rather had to say. What are you thinking, Fidel Castro? What are you thinking? But Dan Rather didn't. He didn't confront him. I don't know why. I have no idea. I mean, do Americans just simply have an affinity for Cuban people? It's possible. It's possible. Do Americans just simply have an affinity for Mexican people? It's possible. That's also possible. And the reason I bring up Cuba and Mexico, ladies and gentlemen, is because if you look at some of the things that the U.S. federal government has allowed Cuba and Mexico to get away with in this country, it's hard to know whether or not the federal government is acting on behalf of the will of the people. Is it the will of the people to allow a country to dump out its prisons of all the felons and send them to your country so that they can be dope dealers and raise the machine gun violence rate in your country? Is that the will of the people? Are the American people that sympathetic towards the Cuban country and its people to where a dictator there named Fidel Castro can dump out the felons out of his prisons, put them on boats, and send them to the state of Florida to act as narco-terrorists? Is it that the American people's heart is just simply that sympathetic to the Cuban plight? Is the American heart, its collective mindset, sympathetic to the plight of Mexicans? Because, you know, Mexican presidents have done the same thing. In the 1970s and 80s, they looked over at Fidel Castro and said, hey, smart move, Fidel. You found a way to clean up Cuban society by emptying out the prisons of your felons and then putting those felons on boats and sending them to Americans and let the Americanos deal with them. That's a smart move, Fidel. Because you know what? The United States was not sending them back to Cuba. They were keeping them here and letting them push dope and do narco-terrorist activity. And the U.S. federal government allowed that. So Mexico looked over at Cuba and said, hey, we're going to try that here. We're going to try that here in Mexico and see if we can get rid of some of our felons too, so we can clean up Mexican society at the expense of the Americans. And that's exactly what they did too. Mexico did the exact same thing. They did it in the 1970s and they did it in the 1980s. The Mexican government went into their prisons, their penitentiaries, and found all the felons and said, hey, get up, pack up your pajamas, pack up your jail slippers, pack up your toothbrushes and your packs of deodorant, pack up your underwear, your socks, your hairspray, your shampoo, and your toothpaste. And all those felons were looking around like, what? What's happening? And the jailer said, get all your stuff, you're leaving. And all those felons got happy. They said, we're getting out of jail early. And the jailer said, that's right. So those felons got all their stuff and headed towards the exit, and there was a van there. And there were a couple of 30 passenger buses there. And these Mexican felons looked around like, wait a minute, what's happening? I thought we were free. The jailer said, you are free, but you ain't staying in Mexico. And those prisoners said, well, where are you sending us? And the jailer said, you all are going to Texas and California And a few of you were going to bust to Louisiana. And they said, you mean we're about to go to America? The jailer said, that's right. And those felons said, well, we don't have documentation. The jailer said, you don't need documentation. If you come from a Spanish-speaking country, you can go to America and just live. You don't need documentation. You don't need a social security number. You don't need an ID or a driver's license. You don't need a name. You don't need a date of birth. You don't need anything. You don't need an education. You don't need nothing. The Americans are very sympathetic to the plight of the Latin world. And all you felons are going to Texas, California, and Louisiana, and you're going to live off the taxpayer dime for the rest of your life, and ain't nobody going to do nothing about it either. And those Mexicans said, all right, well, shoot, better than being in jail, go on ahead and send us to Texas, Louisiana, and California, and let us start our new life there. And one of the felons jumped up and said, yeah, I'm ready for this new life. He said, the entire time I was in jail here in Mexico, I fantasized about starting a new life in America and finding a wife and raising a family and getting a nice job and not paying taxes, but I really would like to be an American. And another one of the prisoners jumped up and said, yeah, me too. I'm tired of sitting in this hellhole of a prison cell. If I can get over to America, maybe I can get a job as a marijuana dealer or perhaps heroin. And another one jumped up and said, yeah, me too. I hear there are a lot of opportunities to go into black market sales of all kinds of stolen goods, including cars and motorcycles and all kinds of beautiful things. I'm ready to go to America and start a new life. And the jailer said, well, all of you are going to get your chance. Hop on in and don't look back. Yeah. Get on out there. Yeah. Get on over to America and don't come back. Yeah. And Mexico's been sending prisoners to the boatload and Mexico has been sending prisoners out here by the truckload. Let's see, shoot, it's been about 54 years now. And the U.S. federal establishment said, now listen, now we're compassionate. We're a compassionate country. We're compassionate. We're not only wealthy, we're not only strong militarily, but we're compassionate. We are the most compassionate country in the world, and the reason we're the most compassionate country in the world is because we're a country that loves Jesus. And when people come to this country from another country seeking asylum and refuge, well, we're going to let them in because we know that that's what Jesus would want. So what if they drive up the crime rate? So what if they're narco-terrorists? So what if they kidnap people? So what if they do this and that? They're Jesus' children just like we are. And they get to have a good life in America just like you do. So, ladies and gentlemen, it just goes to show that when it really comes right down to it, it's just about decision making. It's about decision making. It's about decision making across the board. The next paragraph reads, this study is based on extensive Senate and House hearings The indictment of 4 senior Cuban government officials for allegedly involving in smuggling of narcotics to the United States and declassified reports by the State and Justice Department. It includes the following exchange between Senator Paula Hawkins, the Republican from Florida, and former U.S. Ambassador to Colombia, Thomas Boyat, in April of 1983. Senator Hawkins: could 4 senior members of the Cuban government be involved in drug trafficking without the knowledge and approval of Fidel Castro? Ambassador Boyat says, no, ma'am. The study also cites the testimony of Mario Estevez Gonzalez, a former member of the Cuban Intelligence Service who in 1983 April told Senator Alphonse D'Amato, the Republican from New York, that Cuba has a network of thousands of agents within the United States who were engaged in multi-million-dollar drug trafficking. Mr. Estevez, who says he turned over to the Cuban government more than $7 million from the sale of drugs in the United States in 1981 and 1982, says it doesn't matter what moves in Cuba or what takes place in Cuba. Nothing gets done in Cuba unless it has the blessing and the price set by Fidel Castro himself. So basically what it's saying there is that Fidel Castro has to approve all major narcotics activity involving Cuba and the United States. It all has to get his approval, otherwise it doesn't get done. This study quotes Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Inter-American Affairs James Michael as testifying in June 1983. We have a report that the Communist Party Presidium, and specifically Fidel Castro, in early 1979 considered a scheme to begin dealing with narcotic smugglers using Cuba as a bridge and support base for the networks to the United States as a mean to aid Cuba economically and to contribute to the deterioration of American society. So what we're seeing here is that so the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Inter-American Affairs is basically saying, and this is a congressional testimony that he's testifying in, that Fidel Castro in 1979 decided to start dealing quite a bit of dope in the U.S. with the expectation of getting cash, enough cash, okay, cash in the billions, to where he could reinvest in Cuba. But he also wanted to send this dope to the United States specifically because it was a thrill for Fidel Castro to see Americans get hooked on drugs. I mean, for Fidel Castro, seeing Americans get hooked on drugs was the icing on the cake. All right, it wasn't so much just about bringing in the billions of dollars in cash every year that he was able to not only help himself with, but help his partners out with it, and then invest some of that money into the Cuban economy. It wasn't just that. I mean, look, ladies and gentlemen, Fidel Castro is one of the first world leaders or heads of state to cast a cocaine stumbling block in front of the United States. All right, ladies and gentlemen, Fidel Castro in the 1980s had a cocaine epiphany. That realization, that cocaine realization that Fidel Castro had assisted him very greatly in the motivation that he needed. He needed cocaine motivation, ladies and gentlemen. And he was able to find that motivation. And he was able to use that motivation in such a way so as to hurry things up a bit. You know? He wanted to hurry things up. He didn't want this to be a 50 or 60 year endeavor. He wanted that cocaine cash right now. And he was willing to do anything to get it. Lie, cheat, kill, steal. It didn't matter to Fidel. If you were holding up business, or if he thought you were an American operative, maybe you were flying a plane over Cuba spying, he'd shoot the plane down. All right. And nothing was going to get in the way of Fidel Castro's cocaine game plan. All right. So the next paragraph reads, ironically, on the CBS Evening News on April 30th, 1984, correspondent Rita Braver reported on federal investigations into an alleged partnership between fugitive financier Robert Besco and Fidel Castro, whereby Colombian cocaine smugglers would use Cuba as a safe harbor, and Cuba would use drug money to illegally acquire high technology and arms shipments from U.S. sources to export elsewhere. The report also included a summary of cases where the U.S. government had verified American-Cuban drug connections. On the very day CBS broadcast Mr. Rather's interview with Mr. Castro on March 19, 1985, Senator Jeremiah Denton, Republican of Alabama, chairman of the Subcommittee on Security and Terrorism, told a hearing which oversees the budget of the Drug Enforcement Administration, we continue to receive information that suggests a strong bond has forged between drug traffickers and terrorists. Testimony provided at previous hearings has established ties among the Cuban government, terrorist organizations, and the drug market. Recent efforts of this subcommittee have developed additional information we believe shows direct linkages among terrorist organizations, the Cuban government, the Nicaraguan government, and drug traffickers. So keep something in mind, ladies and gentlemen. At this particular time, there was a new brand of terrorists that was being looked at by the FBI. This new brand of terrorists are called narco-terrorists. They're basically terrorists that are aligned with a militant group or or a similar entity that operated on behalf of the state. Almost as sort of a narcotics bodyguard and paramilitary organization. All right, but these types of terrorists, these narco-terrorists, they're not doing kamikaze attacks or waging war against any other countries per se. They're just a really bad group of guys that know how to use a bunch of really guerrilla warfare styled weapons, and they use guerrilla warfare style tactics on behalf of the state to protect narcotic shipments. Okay, they're a state-sanctioned militant unit who is supported by taxpayer money and money from World Bank, the Bank of International Settlements, and the International Monetary Fund, which all loan money to what you might describe as third world countries. countries that are underdeveloped economically and socially. Okay, these governments pull money from the taxpayer, and they pull money from their own central banks, and they also pull money from what you might refer to as the central banks of the entire world. Okay, banks that have the ability to loan money directly to governments to help them get themselves out of financial turmoil. Okay, all of these proceeds were being taken by governments in many countries in South America, the Caribbean, Africa, some in Southeast Asia. All right. The governments of these various entities were taking money from the taxpayer, their central banks and world banks of issue, and using that money to fund these militant groups. These militant groups were getting official state funding to protect cocaine shipments. And act on behalf of the state in eliminating anyone who posed a threat, particularly a violent threat, to party officials, particularly the party officials that guaranteed the cash resources that fund these militant groups. You see, they weren't just bodyguards of cocaine shipments, they were also bodyguards of certain political parties. So they were basically a mercenary unit of cocaine protectors and party official bodyguards that took orders. And it had a very organized crime type of setup. They had a very mafioso setup. And these new narco terrorists became seen as a matter of concern to the United States because it was a different kind of terrorist. You see, they weren't looking for opportunities to blow people up with IEDs or do suicide bombing attacks or take airplanes and drive them into the side of buildings, shoot up a neighborhood with a submachine gun. All right, put a bomb inside of a trash can or some other receptacle and blow up anyone who walks past it, that kind of thing. Detonating car bombs on the side of the road. All right, this was a different kind of terrorist, okay? This was the kind of terrorist that had basically a socio-political narcotics affiliation and operated from that posture. The next paragraph reads, "This is not all of the compelling evidence concerning the Castro drug connection. Many U.S. officials would have been eager to show Mr. Castro up for the liar that he is, but they were not put on the air by CBS. Vice President Bush's chief of staff, Admiral Dan Murphy, who also runs the National Narcotics Border Interdiction System, says that what Mr. Castro told Dan Rather was overacting. In the interview, he told me, we have direct evidence and have cited it publicly that Cuban officials are involved in drug trafficking. They let planes carrying drugs fly over their country, and they let ships carrying drugs go through their waters. Admiral Murphy says that if Ron Schlesinger, the CBS reporter who interviewed him, sorry, I lost my place, had asked him about what Mr. Castro said to Mr. Rather, he would have said, this doesn't jibe with our evidence. We have direct evidence that traffickers have used Cuban waters to the island south of Cuba to unload and reload marijuana shipments destined for the U.S. We have tracked aircraft laden with drugs across Cuba, and we know they were laden with drugs because we intercepted them and can see the drugs through their windows. We have watched these planes dump marijuana into the ocean, turn around, fly back over Cuba, and disappear. So the evidence is there, and there's no way you can deny it. Admiral Murphy says he would have said this to Mr. Schlesinger, but he was not asked. He said he was asked about the possibility of sharing information about drugs with Mr. Castro, replying, "I said that this was not necessary because he knows where the hell it is, and all he has to do is stop it." Mr. Schlesinger tells me he thinks that Admiral Murphy, he did ask Admiral Murphy about Mr. Castro's remarks to Mr. Rather, but Admiral Murphy may have had a better memory than I do. In any event, Mr. Rather's report did not include Admiral Murphy saying any of what he told me. So in this exchange, we're talking about a guy by the name of Admiral Murphy, who apparently has sort of an in-house testimony concerning CBS. And Admiral Murphy is somebody that knows the state of Cuba very well also during his research. And apparently a CBS reporter named Rod Schlesinger interviewed Admiral Murphy about Dan Rather's interview. And Admiral Murphy said, we don't like that Dan Rather didn't ask Fidel Castro the tough questions. We wanted Dan Rather to really lay it into Castro, because we have evidence that points to the obvious, which is that Cuban officials, including Castro, have a very heavy hand, not only in the business side of the narcotics, but they have a hand in the what you might call the societal elements of it. Okay, this was a man that used propaganda to make cocaine look like the new Cuban century. Okay, he knew how to brainwash people into thinking that cocaine wasn't such a bad thing. And Americans didn't think cocaine was such a bad thing. I mean, Americans purchased about $25 billion of it a year. So this admiral was just saying, look, Mr. Schlesinger, we're not happy with the Dan Rather interview. He didn't hold Castro into account. So we'll continue. Robert Feldkamp, the head of public affairs for the Drug Enforcement Administration, tells me that he was called by CBS on this drug story. He says he told CBS's legal correspondent, Fred Graham, "We think Cuba's institutionally involved in drug trafficking. We think Mr. Castro has to be aware of Mr. Castro has to be aware of that, or he is sleeping with his head in the sand." Mr. Feldkamp says, and he says that Cuba has allowed its waters to be used for safe havens for drug traffickers from Latin America to the U.S. Mr. Feldkamp says Mr. Graham asked him whether Mr. Castro was communicating with the U.S. and trying to restrict the flow of drugs. He told Mr. Graham, "No, we have no knowledge of this whatsoever," and he says he told Mr. Graham he knew of no letter Mr. Castro is supposed to have written offering such communication. So we got Mr. Feldkamp here, ladies and gentlemen, who's the head of public affairs for the Drug Enforcement Administration, the DEA. His situation is one of, he's their public relations consultant. And he's basically saying, we think, and he was interviewed by CBS's legal correspondent, Fred Graham. Feldkamp told Mr. Graham that we think Cuba is very much involved in, its government is very much involved in narcotics trafficking, very much involved. And it's allowing its waters and its airspace to be used to that end. Mr. Feldkamp was asked by Mr. Graham whether or not Castro was trying to work alongside the United States to halt the drug trafficking. And Mr. Feldkamp said, no, absolutely not. Fidel Castro has not made any attempt whatsoever to halt drug trafficking, and he benefits from it. Mr. Graham says that Mr. Feldkamp did indeed say this to him. Mr. Graham says Mr. Feldkamp told him that the U.S. government has an indictment that alleges Cuban officials have been involved in drug trafficking. But Mr. Graham says he did not report these comments by Mr. Feldkamp to his superiors at CBS because he was told to ask about Mr. Castro's alleged letter offering to cooperate in restricting the flow of drugs. Demanding that I quote him as saying he didn't trust me, Mr. Graham said when I asked him if he was aware of the enormous amount of evidence implicating Cuba and Mr. Castro in the international drug trade, he said, I don't know. So Mr. Graham was basically saying that he was restricted by his superiors at CBS. He was told this about Mr. Castro's alleged letter offering to cooperate. Yeah, so it looks like the executives at CBS wanted Mr. Graham to focus on Fidel Castro's alleged cooperation. Let's cooperate. Let's focus on what Fidel says he's trying to do nice. Let's not focus on the narco-terrorism and the machine gun deaths. Let's not focus on the drive-by shootings and the cocaine heists. Let's not focus on the 27-ton dope shipments coming to Florida from Cuba via Nicaragua, Bolivia, and Colombia. Let's not talk about none of that. Let's talk about what Fidel Castro says he's doing nice for America. That's what CBS wanted. So CBS at the time didn't appear to want to get to the truth. They wanted to make Fidel Castro look like this stand-up guy. The next paragraph, Bob Sims, a spokesman for the National Security Council, tells me that in September 1983, Cuba sent a note to the United States saying that there were unauthorized flights over Cuba, probably of planes carrying drugs. But says Mr. Sims, in October of that year, we wrote back asking for more information about these suspect aircrafts, and the Cubans never replied. Commenting on Arnaud de Bourgrave's appointment as the new editor-in-chief of the Washington Times, Lars Eric Nelson, Washington bureau chief of the New York Daily News, is quoted in the Washington Post as saying he's a very talented and courageous guy, but he seems to me to have gotten hung up on a philosophy that the KGB has become the dominant influence in American journalism through disinformation or suppression of vast numbers of stories about a communist plot. Well, now Mr. de Bourgrave has never said that the KGB has a dominant influence in American journalism, but Mr. Rather's disgraceful interview of Fidel Castro is certainly an astonishing example of the suppression of a major communist plot to use drugs to destroy America. So that concludes the article, ladies and gentlemen. It basically concludes by quoting Bob Sims, a spokesman for the National Security Council. Who basically said that in September 1983, Cuba sent a note to the U.S. saying there were unauthorized flights over Cuba, probably of planes carrying drugs. And then Mr. Sims wrote the federal government of Cuba back, probably Fidel Castro himself, and asked, all right, tell us about these unauthorized planes carrying dope that are flying over Cuba. Tell us about them. And the Cuban government never responded. So apparently that was just sort of a paper tiger that the Cuban government was using to make it look as if, well, you know, we are cooperating. We are cooperating in this fight that the U.S. has against narco-terrorists. As a matter of fact, we just told the U.S. federal government the other day, hey, there was a plane flying over Cuba and had some dope on it. And America's representatives, probably from the U.S. Army, or not the U.S. Army, but the I don't know, probably, it doesn't say here what department. Oh, the National Security Council. So people from the National Security Council, the National Security Council of the United States, they wrote Cuba back, probably the Directorate of National Intelligence, and wrote him and said, tell us more. Thank you for coming forward. What happened? A drug plane flew over Cuba. Wow. We want to know more. What happened? And Cuba shut the door and said, all right, now get out of here. All right, ladies and gentlemen. So, we're going to move on to the next portion of this lecture. We are going to be reading just give me 1 second. All right, this is a CIA document. It's called Cuban Drug Policy. And we are going to start. Oh, and the date on this is, it says approved for release in 2009, but that's when it was approved for the release. Give me 1 second. I'm going to try to find the date on this. All right, so the date on this this particular document is not. It's not on the sheets of. It's not on the sheets of paper that I have. I'm gonna have to go back and look at it, but it's probably around 1980. So, this is a CIA document, and it's about CIA discoveries. And we're going to read through these, and we're going to get an analysis on the Cuban situation from the eyes of the CIA. Now, let's see, mid-1970s, May 1983, 77, 78. Yeah, this document is probably circa 1989. And it's going to be the Cuban drug policy through the eyes of the CIA. So there's one more point of order I need to address. So there are parts of this document that are blotted out or blacked out. That's called a redaction. In official government documents, sometimes there are redactions to parts of the document that may be considered ultra sensitive. I know what a redaction is myself. I've actually had sort of a multi-year dispute, a multi-year civil rights dispute with the Miami-Dade Public Library System, and some of the records that I've pulled concerning myself as a patron were redacted. They were blacked out. And that's because library files are federally kept, and federally kept documents, depending on the sensitivity of the topic or the subject, may be redacted. So that if anyone were to review those documents, the ultra sensitive portions of that document are not accessible or available. So this document here is very much a redacted document, and quite frankly, ladies and gentlemen, but it's not going to disrupt what we have as far as overall information. We still have all the information we need here. The only piece of information that I've had to speculate on is the date that this document was put together, which, for all intents and purposes, is probably 1989. Given what I've observed about the document and the various dates and times that are stamped on the document, it's going to be a 1989 document. It's a CIA document. When I was putting this lecture together, the date on this particular document eluded me, but nonetheless, the information is here. It's valid. This is a unclassified CIA document, and we are going to get right into it, ladies and gentlemen. Just give me 1 second, please. I'm going to grab a piece of tobacco as I continue. And while I'm getting my tobacco, ladies and gentlemen, I feel rather compelled to sort of put it out there that, you know, every country has its shortcomings. No country is perfect. No country is perfect. No country is perfect because no people are perfect. But when you're talking about matters of the state, it has to be treated with some respect, because the state is a very powerful thing. The state is a very powerful institution. The state is a very powerful, it's a very powerful instrument. And if you're going to use that, if you're going to use that instrument, you got to use it for the public good. Otherwise, disastrous things can happen. Now, I know that Cuba's been making strides toward the right direction, and they want to fit in with the global community in a way that is cohesive to the global community. I think some things are happening in Cuba, though, that the president of Cuba needs to make himself aware of. All right, Fidel Castro was a cocaine-obsessed man. And so was his brother Raul Castro. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the facts are the facts. The facts are the facts. We've had Senate testimonies. We've had every kind of testimony you can imagine at the federal level about Cuba's governments and the Cuban government's involvement in this. Imagine an entire government getting in behind the cocaine business. All right, now I got some people that look at me kind of sideways. When they hear me talk about this stuff, because there are some people right here in Miami-Dade County that are trying to implicate me in something. You know, they want to discredit my lectures. Well, he knows so much about cocaine because he's involved in it. Ah, that's a bunch of hogwash. All right, and it seems to me that there are some people here in Miami-Dade County that would like to see me get involved in such a thing, and I just ignore them. But it just goes to show, ladies and gentlemen, that ultimately, in Miami-Dade County, there is still that element. There is still that element here. And when it comes right down to it, the only way to alleviate ourselves from this scourge is to take action. And when action is taken at the federal level, you know, we can step in. I mean, this is a matter of national security. So there's a dump truck that just pulled up, and it is now leaving. So it created quite a bit of noise there. But ladies and gentlemen, we all want to see Cuba do the right thing, because if Cuba does the right thing, there'll be less narco-terrorism in Miami, which is something I don't want to see. So this article begins Havana views, or this document begins Havana views the domestic use of illicit drugs as ideological, unacceptable moral weakness. Cuba has a repressive enforcement system aimed at violations of its strict drug laws and maintains that it does not have a significant domestic drug problem. Although Cuba's domestic drug policy appears rigid, Havana has been known to bend the rules to suit its purposes. Now, before that dump truck came, I guess they're doing some kind of construction. It just came and left. I mentioned that we would like to see Cuba do the right thing, and it talks a good game. The Cuban government has said, well, we detest narcotics trafficking, but then it turns around and uses its taxpayers' money to fund narcotics trafficking. And it's saying one thing and it's doing another. So domestic drug policy, point 2 is illicit drugs do not constitute a major domestic law enforcement problem. For the Cuban police, the authorities, for example, have made no effort to marshal public opinion against illegal drug use, a standard tactic used to counter other types of antisocial behavior. Lack of evidence is not just a problem with prosecution in most drug cases. Jail sentences are usually stiff, ranging from 3 to 20 years for drug-related offenses. At the same time, it is clear that drugs are available to those Cubans who have the money and the appropriate contracts. And there have been cases which the Cuban courts have passed more lenient sentences. So Cuba has created a false narrative and has tried to pass itself off as innocent in this investigation, but it is not innocent. And this is coming from somebody who can see a false narrative coming from a mile away. I've had false narratives leveled against me, particularly by Miami-Dade County Public Library System and the Miami-Dade Sheriff's Office, which is working with the Miami-Dade County Library System to silence me on matters concerning clandestine gang stalking. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to jointly criminalize me, so that I will have problems doing my work. And both the Miami-Dade Public Library System and the Miami-Dade Sheriff's Office have participated in a years-long campaign to try and criminalize me, so that I cannot bring these facts to you. Because keep in mind, ladies and gentlemen, we are in a part of the world in South Florida where these matters concerning Cuba, drug trafficking and narco-terrorism, okay, black market activity and organized crime are, they're prevalent. And they've permeated the social order here. And I'm speaking out against these matters. And, you know, far be it from me to accuse anybody in the Miami-Dade Public Library System or the Sheriff's Office here of participating in narco-terrorism. But I'm right at the point to where I want to allege that members of the Miami-Dade Public Library System and the Sheriff's Office are participating in narco-terrorism. And part of narco-terrorism is getting rid of your opposition. I am opposed to narco-terrorism, regardless of if it's happening on the black market or regardless of if it's happening at the behest of the Cuban government. I'm against it. All right? We presently have a Cuban Secretary of State in Marco Rubio who is, you know, he's come out strong against narco-terrorism in Cuba, and he said that he believes that Cuba is a state sponsor of terrorism. But he has stopped short of saying, well, because of that, I think some of those narco-terrorist influences have made their way into Miami-Dade County. He has not said that. He needs to say it, but he hasn't. But he hasn't said it. And that's disappointing to me. I think that the Department of State should issue a statement, a public statement, saying that, you know what, this narco-terrorist situation, a lot of it has roots in Cuban drug operations in the land of Cuba. That's important, and that needs to be talked about. So, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to skip over to drug policy regarding foreigners. And what I'm doing is I'm trying to minimize redundancy. So the talking points that I've already covered during this lecture, we're not going to cover them a second time. We're going to move on into fresh topics within this discussion. And we're going to skip over into drug policy regarding foreigners. That's point number 6. So foreigners are occasionally arrested by the Cubans on drug trafficking charges. Some of these, even though they're innocent, have been jailed simply on the suspicion that they were transporting illegal cargoes. It appears that Cubans are harder on American suspects than those of other nationalities. For example, in May 1983, Cuban authorities arrested 3 foreigners and charged them with illegal entry and drug trafficking. The 2 Americans were detained while the Japanese woman who accompanied them was released and expelled from Cuba. So basically, what that's showing us is that the Cuban government is using foreigners as a scapegoat to try to make it look as if they are on top of things with respect to narcotics trafficking, particularly in Cuba. All right, they're not arresting other Cubans. They're not arresting Colombians or Nicaraguans or Bolivians or Mexicans or Chileans or Peruvians. They're allowed to buy and sell dope freely in Cuban infrastructures. But if you're an American or if you're a Japanese person, you can go to jail in Cuba just simply for being suspected of having some dope. You see, so there's a double standard there. You can do business with the Cuban government on some dope trafficking. You just better not be American or Cuban trying to do it, because you're going to go to jail and you're going to get banned from the country. All right, so we are going to skip over into the next page, and we're going to look at point number 42. This is on page 19. Despite Cuba's strict drug laws, Havana probably will continue to adapt its drug policy to suit its purposes. Although Havana will continue to reiterate its record of stringent domestic drug control and occasionally arrest drug traffickers entering its waters and airspace, we judge it highly unlikely that Havana will cooperate with the international drug interdiction effort. So what point 42 is saying is that on paper, Cuba does have laws against drug trafficking, but it doesn't enforce those laws at all. They're just laws to appease the international community and make the international community think that Cuba is on top of things with respect to the eradication of international drug smuggling. But they're just words on paper. They're not enforced. Okay? So we're going to move to the next page. This one's going to be on page 17. So we're going to go backwards to page 17, and we're going to look at the implications for U.S. policy. We're going to look at point 39. It says it's likely that Havana will take advantage of continued involvement in drug trafficking to promote Cuban subversive activities and political goals, to earn hard currency and to obtain embargoed goods. To minimize the risk of exposure, Havana will prefer to deal with selected drug traffickers who are less likely to be apprehended and who have enormous amounts of resources and international connections that Cuba can use to serve its interests. We see little reason why traffickers will hesitate to comply with Havana's requirements. So what this is saying is that it looks like Havana, okay, which is the center of Cuban government and the capital city, will take advantage of continued involvement in drug trafficking, and doing so to sort of anchor Cuban political goals, which include atrocities. I mean, they do kidnappings, they do extortions, they do blackmails, they do murder for hires, they do drug heists, they do they put together multi-million-dollar shipments and combine them to multi-billion-dollar shipments, and they peddle these narcotics to Western buyers for billions in profit on a yearly basis, and that is sort of it's a political objective for the Cuban government, according to this document. So what we're going to do is we're going to scroll back to page 4, and we're going to look at, and I'm reading these paragraphs in reverse order because they're not exactly chronological, so it doesn't really matter what order you read these pages in. They all contain paragraphs that are equally relevant to each other with respect to the topic that we're discussing. So you're not missing out, and you're not losing information by reading these paragraphs non-chronologically. So we're reading from page 4. We're going to read where it says available evidence, that talking point. Available evidence indicates that Cuba is used as a transshipment point for some Colombian drugs bound for the United States in an effort to circumvent U.S. maritime drug interdiction efforts. So what that's indicating is that the Colombians, who have a vested interest in Cuba, because the government of Colombia is known for putting together drug shipments and sending those drug shipments to Cuba. And then from Cuba, those drug shipments are being shipped to the United States. You see, so Colombia is not shipping dope to the U.S. using its resources. It's using its resources to cultivate the cocaine, package the cocaine, and ship the cocaine to Cuba. And Cuba is the one that is shipping the cocaine on boats to the United States. It's the same kind of arrangement that Nicaragua and Bolivia have with Cuba. They cultivate the cocaine, they package the cocaine, and they ship the cocaine to Cuba, and Cuba ships the cocaine to the U.S. And then the cash comes back to Cuba. They take their cut, and then they give the remaining amounts to the governments of Nicaragua, Colombia, and other interested parties, other involved parties. So we're going to scroll back to page 3, and it's going to be the key judgments portion of the argument. It says here key judgments, and we're going to read key judgments and close the lecture, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for listening. It says that Cuba currently is supporting drug trafficking, and we believe that this support will continue during the next few years. Although Havana is sensitive to U.S. evidence of Cuban involvement in drug trafficking, it realizes it can benefit from continued participation in the drug trade as long as it can plausibly deny its support. Furthermore, drug traffickers faced with improving enforcement efforts and growing competition from other emerging trafficking groups will probably continue to seek assistance from Cuba. So basically, it's not just Cubans that are facilitating this dope smuggling. It's Cuba in conjunction with other countries. That's something that we've already covered. We judge that Fidel Castro is fully cognizant of and condones the drug-related activity that is taking place with the support of the Cuban officials. Despite Havana's puritanical stance on drug use and its official condemnation of the traffickers, Fidel Castro is very involved and profits personally and politically from drug trafficking, although he says that Cuba has nothing to do with drug trafficking. The key Cuban participants in drug trafficking are officers of the Interior Ministry of the America Department of the Cuban Communist Party Central Committee, who are responsible for intelligence activities and promoting subversive activities in Latin America. Their participation strongly indicates a sanctioned government policy rather than an arrangement for personal gain. So this is a reiteration. It is the Cuban government that is peddling this dope. And it's like, this. Cuba is using its Air Force, its Navy, and its Director of National Intelligence to peddle dope, period. And it's using its government resources to that end. And it's a matter of government policy, although it's a silent government policy. You're not going to find anywhere in the Cuban Constitution, you're not going to find anywhere in Cuban legal codes, all right? You're not going to find anywhere in Cuban high court decisions where it says, hey, we're going to use our national resources to not only facilitate drug trafficking, but use it as a national export, right? It's a government policy, but it's a silent government policy. It's something that's done off the books, so no one gets wise to it. Next paragraph reads that we believe that Havana's objectives for supporting the drug trade are to promote Cuban subversive activities and political goals, to earn hard currency, and to obtain embargoed goods. Cuban involvement in drug trafficking may help to promote Cuban political objectives in the Western Hemisphere. Cuban intelligence officers have developed links to drug traffickers that enable them to promote intelligence operative and subversive activities. A Cuban-supported drug trafficker may have already provided financial backing for the General Directorate for Intelligence Political Action Goals in the United States. The effectiveness of gun runners and political and professional smugglers in supplying arms to the Sandinistas in 1979 apparently persuaded Havana that such connections would be useful in efforts to arm other insurgent and terrorist groups. It is likely that Cuba will continue to use established smuggling networks to transport arms to subversive organizations, and this will enable Cuba to support their operations in the region while maintaining plausible denial. Havana also is counting on continuing to receive hard currency from drug traffickers, some of which to help finance subversive activities. All right, and we're going to stop there, okay? Because the rest of the key judgments portion of this document contains talking points that we've already covered. So we're going to stop there, and we're going to look at some of the implications here. So it's basically saying that Cuban intelligence officers have developed links to drug traffickers. And the reason the Cuban intelligence agencies are assisting drug traffickers is so that drug traffickers can do their job more safely and under the radar. It's difficult to catch a drug smuggler who is being directed and guided by the Cuban national intelligence community. All right, it's big business. It's lucrative business. People in the Directorate of National Intelligence in Cuba stand to triple their income, their yearly income, by protecting dope traffickers. It's a no-brainer. Why wouldn't you do it? You see, that's a lot of people's mentality about drug smuggling. If you can get away with it, if you can make six figures doing it, then why the hell not? Right? And that's been the Cuban government's attitude towards narcotics smuggling for about at least 50 years. At least. And you have the national security apparatus of Cuba participating. And ladies and gentlemen, I see some of that here in Miami-Dade County. There's no doubt about it. There's no doubt about it at all. And I think when we can draw the link between a lot of the narco-terrorism that rears its ugly head here in Miami-Dade County to Cuban government activity, then we will be on the path to stabilizing this country in its totality. I mean, I don't care if this is a resort town. We don't need narco-terrorists here destabilizing the region and making it so that your path or your trajectory through life is more dangerous because of the activity. To me, that's not an American principle or ideal. Now, you got some people in the United States that say, well, you know, maybe we do have some terrorists here, you know, and smuggle dope, but they seem to like America all right. These narco-terrorist dope dealers are starting businesses with that dope money and are paying taxes to the U.S. federal government off those businesses they're starting, and well, they're not getting into too much trouble. I mean, yeah, they're killing people off, but it looks like they're killing off the riffraff and other kinds of people who might get involved with the kinds of crimes that they do. You let those dope smugglers kill each other off. That's the attitude of a lot of Americans toward this. But it's just not that simple. You can't write off that a foreign country may be using organized crime, black market activity, and narco-terrorist protocols right here in the United States. I mean, that's something that should not be ignored. And I hope that in future days, weeks, months, and years, the Congress of the United States will look over at Cuba and say, well, you know, you're our neighbor, and we want to have as good a relationship with you as we can, but we can't let you finance narco-terrorism in this country anymore. And the reason we can't let you finance narco-terrorism in this country anymore is because it erodes, corrupts, and decomposes the American way of life. And I think that that's something worth looking at. I think that's something worth acknowledging. I think that's something worth researching. And I think that that's something that's worth looking into at an international level. On an international level. Because if you see in the previous paragraphs read, there are multiple instances of international narco-terrorism that's going on. I mean, it's not just slap-happy dope peddlers trying to spread the joy of drugs throughout America. These are people that have organized crime elements and have every capacity whatsoever to unleash cocaine hell upon society. And those kinds of drugs drive up the crime rate. Those kinds of drugs drive up the crime rate. So we're going to leave it there, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for listening, and have a wonderful day.